I'm Emily. I'm 32 years old, and this is the story of how my parents tried to erase me from their will, only for the lawyer to read a different page that left them frozen. The first time I heard the words, I thought I'd misheard. The room was so still that I could hear the soft scratch of the lawyer's pen against the folder on his desk, the click of the clock on the wall, even the faint hiss of the heating vent. My parents were sitting opposite me, their faces carved from stone, smug in that way only people who believe they've won can look. And then came the line, read in that measured, professional voice. According to this version of the will, the estate is to be divided equally between both children. Their heads snapped toward him, eyes wide, lips parting as if the air had just been ripped out of their lungs. For a second, the silence turned into something alive. That was the moment they realized they weren't as clever as they thought. 2 months earlier, I wouldn't have believed any of this was possible. My family wasn't perfect, but I thought we had a baseline of decency. My parents always played favorites, sure, but I'd told myself it was just an old habit. My younger brother, Alex, could do no wrong in their eyes. Every mistake was excused, every bill was quietly covered, every bad decision was painted as finding his way. Meanwhile, if I achieved something, it was treated like background noise, just a given, not worth clapping for. I'd learned to live with that imbalance, even joke about it. What I hadn't learned to live with was betrayal. The first red flag showed up after my grandfather passed away. He wasn't wealthy, but he left behind a modest house and some savings. He'd always told me that he wanted things to be fair, that both his grandchildren deserved something to get started in life. So when I went to the funeral and overheard my parents whispering about consolidating the assets, my stomach dropped. They spoke like accountants, not grieving children. Later, when I asked what Grandpa had left for us, they brushed me off. Don't worry about it, Emily. It's all being handled. That was the moment I felt the first crack in the floor beneath me. I didn't push right away. I didn't want to be the dramatic daughter making scenes in the middle of grief, but I noticed little things. The way Alex suddenly had a newer car, the way Mom kept avoiding eye contact when I asked about paperwork, the way Dad's voice hardened when I mentioned fairness. It was as if I was being quietly erased, not just from the conversation, but from the family record. And it hurt in a way I can't fully put into words. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about respect. It was about knowing my place in the family wasn't conditional, that I wasn't disposable. The second blow came in the form of a phone call. My aunt, who had always been more like a second mother to me, called to say she'd seen my parents at the bank signing documents with Alex. She asked, gently, if I was being included in the will updates. My heart stopped. I hadn't heard anything about updates. I asked her what she meant, but she just sighed and said, Emily, you might want to ask them directly. Something doesn't feel right. That night, I barely slept. The walls of my apartment felt too close, my bed too cold. My parents, my own parents, were cutting me out, and they hadn't even bothered to warn me. When I finally confronted them, I chose my words carefully. I didn't storm in, I didn't shout. I asked simply if they'd updated their will, and if so, whether Alex and I were still being treated equally. The reaction I got told me everything. My mom pursed her lips like she'd bitten into something sour. My dad's jaw tightened and he said, "We don't have to explain ourselves to you." Then Alex, leaning back in his chair like a king in his throne, smirked and said, "Maybe if you visited more often, you'd be included." That line burned through me like acid. It wasn't just cruel, it was rehearsed. He wanted me to hear it. I drove home that night with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I replayed every family memory in my head, trying to figure out how we'd gotten here. How could people who raised me now treat me like an outsider? Was I really that easy to discard? But under the grief and anger, a different emotion began to stir. Resolve. If they thought they could just cut me out and get away with it, they were about to find out I wasn't as powerless as they imagined. The first step was information. I began by calling the lawyer who'd handled my grandfather's estate. He was polite, but cagey, reminding me that I wasn't technically a client of his. Still, I asked questions, careful ones. I learned that wills aren't just whispers in the dark. They're documents, legally binding, filed and recorded. And sometimes people forget that earlier versions exist. That was when the first spark of an idea flickered to life in my mind. Meanwhile, my parents grew bolder. They stopped hiding their favoritism. At a family dinner, my mom toasted Alex for all his hard work I knew he hadn't actually done, projects I'd helped him with behind the scenes. My dad pulled me aside afterward and said, almost casually, "You should think about your future on your own. Don't expect handouts." It was framed as advice, but it landed like a knife in the ribs. They wanted me to know I was out. They wanted me to feel it. The final straw came when I received a thin envelope in the mail. Inside was a polite letter from their lawyer, formally informing me that I was no longer a beneficiary in their will. No explanation, no conversation, no warning, just a piece of paper telling me I was erased. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at it, my breath shallow, my pulse hammering. Then slowly, I folded the letter back into its envelope and placed it in a drawer. Because if they thought that was the end of the story, they were wrong. That was only the beginning. I started making my own calls, reaching out to contacts I'd almost forgotten I had. An old friend who'd gone into paralegal work, a professor from college who'd specialized in contract law, even my aunt again, who confirmed what I already suspected. My parents had rewritten their will to give everything to Alex. But here's the thing about legal documents. They're only as final as the last signed version. And sometimes people are careless about the trail they leave behind. That trail, I realized, was my way back in. I wasn't reckless about it. I knew that if I stormed in waving accusations, I'd lose before the fight even began. My parents had already decided I was disposable. Giving them proof I was difficult would only confirm their narrative. So I played it calm, patient, deliberate. I began with research. I asked my paralegal friend what options I had, and she said something that stuck with me. People forget how often they contradict themselves on paper. If they've made multiple wills or trusts, older versions can still come back to haunt them. That was all I needed to hear. Meanwhile, my parents kept tightening the screws. They stopped inviting me to family events, at least officially. I'd hear about dinners or trips after the fact through cousins or neighbors. Alex, of course, was front and center in every photo they posted online. He even tagged me in one once, a group shot at a vacation cabin. His caption was cruel in its simplicity: family only. It wasn't just a statement, it was a weapon. They wanted me to feel invisible, and for a while, I almost did. But invisibility has a strange advantage. It makes you harder to predict. The second escalation came a few weeks later. My mom called me out of the blue. Her tone was cold, rehearsed, the way you might speak to a coworker you barely tolerate. She said they'd finalized their arrangements and that I shouldn't expect anything. I asked her why. Just once, I wanted her to say it out loud, to give me the courtesy of honesty. But she refused. Instead, she said, "Alex has always been more present. You've chosen your own path, that's fine, but choices have consequences." I hung up the phone, shaking. Not from fear this time, but from fury. Present? I'd been the one who visited Grandpa in the hospital every week, the one who helped pay for their anniversary party when Alex forgot. I'd been present when it mattered. But clearly that wasn't the story they wanted to tell. It was around this time that I made my first attempt at peace. I wrote them a letter. Not an angry one, not a guilt trip. just honest. I explained how their decision made me feel, how being cut out of their lives financially wasn't just about the money, but about the message it sent, that I was unloved, unwanted, and erased. I asked for a conversation, a chance to fix things before they became permanent. I mailed it with a shaky hand, hoping for a crack in their armor. The reply came 3 days later, and it wasn't from them. It was from Alex. He texted me a photo of my letter, torn into pieces, spread across their kitchen table. His caption was just 3 words: message received, denied. My stomach turned. That wasn't just rejection. That was cruelty, sharpened to a point. My parents hadn't even had the decency to respond themselves. They'd let my brother mock me instead. That was the moment I knew peace wasn't coming. And yet, life has a strange way of giving you ammunition when you least expect it. A week later, my aunt invited me over for tea. She was careful with her words, like she knew she was treading dangerous ground. But then she slid a folder across the table. Inside were photocopies, not originals, but close enough. It was a copy of my parents' previous will, signed just 2 years earlier, which listed me and Alex as equal beneficiaries. She told me she'd found it in some old files when helping clean out Grandpa's things. My parents had left it there, careless, forgetting that paper has a way of surviving. I held that folder in my hands like it was gold, because in a way, it was. With proof in hand, I began to plan. I didn't want revenge just for the sake of it. I wanted justice. I wanted them to look me in the eye and realize they couldn't rewrite history just to erase me. But more than that, I wanted to do it in a way that left no doubt, no loophole, no misunderstanding. I started making appointments, quietly, with people who knew more about these things than I did. Lawyers, advisors, anyone who could tell me how to use this without burning myself in the process. Meanwhile, my parents and Alex kept digging their hole deeper. At a cousin's wedding, they arrived like royalty, bragging openly about keeping the estate intact for Alex. One of my uncles even pulled me aside and asked if it was true. When I said yes, he shook his head and muttered, "That's cruel, Emily. You don't deserve that." It was the first time someone outside the immediate family had acknowledged what was happening. And it gave me strength. Because when you're gaslit long enough, you start doubting your own reality. Hearing someone else confirm it felt like fresh air after being underwater too long. The overreach moment came soon after. Alex showed up at my apartment unannounced. He leaned against my doorway, smirking like a man who thought he owned the ground beneath his feet. He said, "You should start downsizing, Em. Once Mom and Dad are gone, you won't have any safety net. Better get used to standing on your own 2 feet." He said it with a kind of theatrical pity, like he was doing me a favor by spelling it out. I stood there, gripping the doorframe, forcing myself not to react. But inside, something shifted. That was the moment the scales tipped. I no longer just wanted justice. I wanted them to choke on their arrogance when the truth came out. And oh, the truth was coming. I didn't slam the door on Alex. I didn't argue. I let him walk away thinking he'd won. Because what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the ace card was already in my hand, and soon, in the most public, undeniable way possible, I was going to play it. After Alex's smug little doorstep performance, I knew there was no going back. I wasn't just the black sheep anymore. I was the ghost they thought they'd erased. But ghosts have a way of haunting the living. Every cruel word, every smug smile, every piece of paper they waved like a trophy only fueled me. They thought they'd written me out. They thought the story was over. What they didn't know was that the next chapter was mine to write. The first stage of my plan was simple: gather receipts. Not literal shopping receipts, though those would come into play later, but evidence. Solid, undeniable proof that my parents had deliberately tried to disinherit me while pretending to keep everything above board. That's the thing about people who think they're invincible. They get sloppy. My parents and Alex were no exception. I started with the copy of the old will my aunt had given me. It was like holding a live grenade, dangerous but powerful. The document was clear. Both children were equal beneficiaries, dated, signed, witnessed. And while newer versions might overwrite it, the existence of multiple drafts could raise serious questions about intent and manipulation, especially if one party had pressured the other. I scanned every page, backed it up in 3 different places, and even sent a sealed copy to a trusted friend with instructions. If anything happened to me, she was to hand it over to a lawyer. Dramatic? Maybe. But I wasn't leaving anything to chance. Then I dug deeper. My paralegal friend explained how estate changes usually work: witnesses, signatures, notarization. If my parents had been careless with any of those steps, I might have leverage. So I quietly began requesting public records, pulling every scrap of paperwork I could get my hands on. And what do you know? There were inconsistencies. Different signatures that didn't quite match, witnesses who just happened to be Alex's buddies, changes made suspiciously close to big financial moves in his life, like when he bought that new car. The puzzle pieces were lining up, and they painted a picture that was far from clean. Meanwhile, I kept playing my role. To my parents, I was quiet, resigned, licking my wounds. To Alex, I was defeated, too tired to fight. I answered their calls politely, smiled tightly at family events, nodded along when they bragged, because I wanted them comfortable. I wanted them lulled into believing they'd broken me. Because when people stop watching you closely, that's when you can move the chess pieces into place. The next step was allies. My aunt was already on my side, but I needed more. I reached out to my uncle, the one who'd whispered at the wedding that I didn't deserve this. Over coffee, I told him everything, showed him the copies. His face darkened as he read, his jaw tightening the way my father's did, but with anger on my behalf instead of against me. He said, "This isn't just unfair, it's dishonest. And if they think they can do this without anyone noticing, they're wrong." He agreed to back me up if it came down to a confrontation. That was 2 allies, 2 more than I'd had when this started. But the real masterstroke came from a conversation with my professor. I'd reached out under the guise of wanting career advice, but once we met, I laid it all out. She leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers, and said something I'll never forget. "Emily, wills aren't just about money, they're about stories. Your parents are trying to rewrite the story of your family, but if you control the narrative, if you show the world their version isn't the only one, you win, not just legally, but morally." That's when it clicked. This wasn't about fighting fire with fire. It was about putting their hypocrisy on display so bright they couldn't hide from it. So I built my plan like a script. Act 1, gather proof. Act 2, secure allies. Act 3, set the stage. And the stage, I realized, would have to be a lawyer's office. Their lawyer's office, ideally. The place they felt safest, where they thought the outcome was locked. If I could flip the script in that room, in front of witnesses, the shock would be complete. In the weeks leading up to the meeting, I was meticulous. I printed documents, organized timelines, rehearsed responses. I didn't want to show up flustered or emotional. I wanted calm, sharp precision. Every cruel word Alex had ever thrown at me, every smug look from my parents, those would be the fuel, but I wouldn't let them show. Because nothing scares manipulators more than the person they thought was weak standing in front of them with unshakable composure. And oh, there was one more thing. I wanted a line. One single sentence that would land so hard, it would echo in their heads long after the meeting ended. Something simple, devastating, undeniable. I practiced it in the mirror, refining it until it fit like a blade sliding into a sheath, because when the time came, I wasn't just going to win. I was going to leave them frozen. The day of reckoning was coming. They just didn't know it yet. The morning of the meeting, I woke up with a strange calm. No racing heart, no shaking hands, just a clear sense of purpose. I dressed simply, nothing flashy, but professional enough to command respect. My documents were neatly stacked in a folder, the old will on top, like a hidden ace. As I locked my apartment door, I whispered to myself the line I'd practiced 100 times. It felt like armor. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of coffee and old wood polish. I arrived early, of course, and sat in the waiting room, listening to the muted tick of the clock. Then the door opened, and in walked my parents and Alex. My mother's lips curved in that tight smile she used when she wanted to appear gracious, but was brimming with disdain. My father gave me a curt nod, as if acknowledging a distant colleague. And Alex walked in like he owned the place, tossing me a smirk that said, "You're wasting your time." We were ushered into the conference room, where the lawyer sat at the head of the table, a thick folder in front of him. He was the picture of neutrality, his glasses perched low, his tone professional. "Thank you all for coming. We're here to go over the finalized documents." My parents leaned back, smug. Alex drummed his fingers on the table, already looking bored. I sat quietly, waiting. The lawyer began reading, his voice even. According to the most recent version of the will, the estate is to be transferred. My stomach knotted, but I kept my face neutral. He continued, "Entirely to the son, Alex." My parents exhaled like a weight had been lifted. Alex smirked wider. I waited for the silence that followed, and then leaned forward just slightly. "With respect," I said calmly, sliding my folder across the table, "there's another version you might want to look at." The lawyer blinked, taken aback. My parents stiffened. Alex scoffed. "She's just making stuff up." But the lawyer opened the folder, adjusted his glasses, and began to read. His brows furrowed. The room grew still. And then, in that same professional tone, he said, "According to this version, the estate is to be divided equally between both children." The effect was instant. My parents' faces drained of color. My mother's lips parted as though the air had been stolen from the room. My father's jaw dropped slightly, his hand twitching against the armrest. And for once, Alex was speechless. His smirk vanished, replaced with a look I'd never seen before. Fear. "That's an outdated draft," my father finally blurted. His voice was sharp, desperate. But the lawyer didn't look up. He kept reading, flipping through the pages, noting the signatures, the witnesses. "It is dated only 2 years prior. Legally, this could complicate matters if contested." My mother leaned forward, her voice trembling now. "Emily doesn't understand how this works. We've moved on from that version. It's irrelevant." But her words didn't carry the authority she wanted them to. She sounded cornered. I kept my voice steady, calm, rehearsed. "I understand perfectly. What I don't understand is why you felt the need to erase me. Grandpa wanted things to be fair. You both signed off on that once. What changed?" My line was ready. I let it hang in the air like a blade. Then I delivered it slow and deliberate. "You didn't cut me out of the family. You cut yourselves out of your integrity." The silence was suffocating.
My words landed with a weight that filled every corner of the room. Alex's fists clenched against the table. My father shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the lawyer. My mother swallowed hard, her hands trembling in her lap. For once, none of them had a comeback. The lawyer cleared his throat. It seems there are conflicting versions of the will. If this were to be challenged in court, both documents would be considered. It would be messy. His emphasis on the last word was deliberate. He was telling them in polite, legal terms that they'd been caught and that fighting me could expose everything. The power shifted in that instant. The smugness evaporated. My parents, who walked in as though they were untouchable, now looked small, cornered. Alex's arrogance had crumbled into anger. But anger without footing is just noise. And I sat there, calm, collected, letting them stew in the reality they created. Perhaps, the lawyer said carefully, it would be in everyone's best interest to revisit the division in a way that avoids litigation. His eyes flicked toward me just for a second. He knew I had the upper hand. He knew I'd played this exactly right.
The drive home that day felt different. The streets looked the same, the traffic lights blinked their usual rhythm, but everything inside me had shifted. So the first time in months, maybe years, I didn't feel powerless. I felt steady, like I'd finally taken the wheel of my own story. My parents thought they were the authors, that they could cross my name out of the book of our family. But I had reminded them, in the most undeniable way possible, that my story wasn't theirs to edit. The fallout came quickly. Within a week, my mother called me, her voice brittle and strained. She tried to sound conciliatory, but the edge was there. "Emily, maybe we were too harsh. Maybe we didn't think things through. Let's just put this behind us." Her tone dripped with false sweetness, the kind that only comes when someone realizes they've been backed into a corner. I let her talk, let her stumble through half-hearted apologies. Then I said, calmly, "You don't get to erase me and then ask me to forget it ever happened." The silence that followed was delicious. Alex, on the other hand, went on the offensive. He texted me long, angry paragraphs about how selfish I was, how I was ruining everything for the family, how I was clinging to money I didn't deserve. I didn't reply. Not once. Because here's the thing. Silence can be louder than shouting. And the more he raged into the void, the more desperate he sounded. His tantrums only proved what I already knew. Without his golden child status, he was nothing. Word spread through the extended family, as it always does. My aunt and uncle quietly told others what had happened, and soon enough, I was getting messages of support from cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. One cousin wrote, "Good for you. They've always treated you unfairly. About time someone stood up to them." Another said, "Don't let them guilt you. They're only sorry they got caught." Each message was a small stone in the foundation of something stronger, my own sense of worth. And then came the real consequence. Money talks, but reputation screams. My father, a man who prided himself on respectability, suddenly found himself the subject of whispered conversations at community events. People asked questions. Why cut out your daughter? Why risk a public fight? He hated it. I could see it in the way his voice grew sharper when we did cross paths, the way his shoulders stiffened as though carrying invisible weight. My mother avoided eye contact altogether, her once perfect social facade cracking under the strain. Legally, the will was revised again, this time with me back in it, equal shares restored. The lawyer made it clear. Contesting this in court could drag out for years, cost a fortune,
and damage reputations irreparably. My parents reluctantly agreed. They didn't do it out of love or fairness. They did it because they had no choice. And that was enough for me, because the victory wasn't just about the money. It was about forcing them to acknowledge me, on paper, in ink, where they couldn't erase me with a smirk or a shrug. The weeks that followed were strangely quiet. No more mocking texts from Alex, no more cold calls from my mother, no more smug comments from my father. It was as if they'd all retreated, licking their wounds in private. For me, the quiet was healing. I went for walks without checking my phone for cruel messages. I cooked dinner without that knot in my stomach. I started sleeping better. Sometimes the greatest revenge is simply peace, the kind of peace your enemies can't take away from you. And yet there was a deeper change too. Standing up to them had taught me something I hadn't expected, that boundaries aren't walls, they're mirrors. When you set them, you show people exactly how much respect you expect. And when they can't handle it, that's not your failure, it's theirs. One evening, weeks later, I got a message from my aunt. It was short, but it made me smile. "You did the right thing. Grandpa would be proud." I sat with that message for a long time, letting it settle in. Because in the end, that was the real inheritance. Not the money, not the house, but the knowledge that I hadn't let them rewrite me out of my own family story. And Alex, well, let's just say his arrogance never fully recovered. Every time I saw him after that, there was a flicker in his eyes. The memory of that lawyer's office, of the moment he realized he couldn't win just by smirking. It was the look of someone who'd been exposed, and it never went away. I didn't celebrate with champagne. I celebrated with a binder. Back home from the lawyer's office, I laid everything out on my kitchen table. Timelines, copies, certified mail receipts, witness lists, call logs. Paper doesn't care about gaslighting. It just sits there and tells the truth. I slipped the old will behind a clear sheet, then the final, revised documents with equal shares and an independent executor, then the signed family settlement memo the lawyer drafted to avoid litigation. The memo mattered. It documented that no child had pressured the other, that revisions were made with counsel present, and that a professional fiduciary, not a relative, would oversee everything when the time came. It was the most adult part of the whole saga. Boring, precise, and binding. For once, we didn't have a family secret. We had paperwork. I wish I could say that after that, we hugged it out and ate roast Sunday like old times. That isn't what happened. Our family didn't snap back. It stretched into a different shape. My mother sent flowers, the kind she gives to neighbors when she's embarrassed. The card said, "Let's move forward." My father sent a separate message with one sentence I read 3 times. "I was wrong to let this become cruel." It wasn't an apology that washed everything clean, but it was a sentence that didn't try to rewrite what happened. Sometimes the most you can get is a sentence that doesn't lie.
The first time I saw Alex afterward was at a barbecue in my aunt's garden. He walked up holding 2 plates, handed one to me without meeting my eyes, and said, "They're doing quarterly statements now." I said, "I know." He shifted his weight the way he does when a script dies in his throat. "You made it complicated," he muttered. I looked at the hedge behind him, at the tiny white flowers shaking in the breeze, and answered, "No, I made it fair." He didn't have a comeback for that. He just walked away, and for once, he didn't look taller than me. He looked like a person my age who had to live with the same rules I did. A month later, the first statement arrived from the trustee. Professional letterhead, line items, dates. It wasn't drama, it was math. I opened it at my kitchen counter, felt the thud of the old knot in my stomach, and then
Nothing. No spike, no panic, just relief. One page, and the whole house of mirrors was gone. I tucked the statement behind the binder's next tab and took a breath like you take when a lift door opens at your floor. Ordinary, overdue, right on time. When people ask me what the best part was, the room, the line, the look on their faces, I tell them it was the moment after, when I realized I didn't have to keep defending what had happened. I had a binder, I had receipts, and if anyone wanted to debate the story, they could debate dates and signatures instead of my sanity. Paper doesn't lie. People do. That's not poetic. It's practical. It's how you win without shouting. It would be easy to turn this into a fairy tale where justice made us closer. The truth is gentler and more useful. We became polite. We became professional. My parents stopped testing my boundaries because the consequences were real and written. Alex stayed prickly, less because the money changed and more because the story did. He wasn't the unquestioned center anymore. He was a beneficiary like me. Equal isn't flattering when you've lived on a pedestal. There was one more conversation that mattered. My aunt and I sat on her back steps at dusk, feet on the warm stone, ice melting in our glasses. "Heard from your mom?" she asked. I told her about the flowers, the card, the sentence from my dad. She nodded. "That's all you needed," she said. "Not their love on demand, not their applause, just the boundary kept." And that was it, really. The revenge wasn't a firework. It was a fence. It stayed up whether anybody liked it or not. Silence can be louder than shouting. I kept my life small for a while after that. Morning walks, a podcast on the way to work, dinner with friends who never made me audition for kindness. I cleaned my flat and gave away a box of things I'd kept to prove I was worthy. Old gifts, old notes, old versions of me. Revenge stories often end with a mic drop. Mine ended with a recycling run and 8 hours of sleep. I don't know if that makes good TV. I know it makes a good life. 2 months later, the trustee scheduled a meeting for both beneficiaries. Not a courtroom, a conference room with glass walls and a bowl of mints. We reviewed the asset list and the reporting calendar. When we finished, the trustee asked, "Any questions?" Alex shook his head. I asked for one thing in writing, that our communications be mirrored to both of us at the same time. "Of course," the trustee said. "That's standard." I smiled. Imagine that. Standard. All the storms I'd weathered, and the solution was a carbon copy line in a system I wasn't allowed to see until I stepped up and asked. "You didn't erase me. You exposed yourself." I don't hate my parents. That would be easier. What I feel is more complicated. A mix of grief for what we never were and something like gratitude for the spine I grew because they left me no other choice. Betrayal taught me how to read a form, how to keep records, how to pause instead of panic. Confusion taught me to ask better questions. Powerlessness taught me the power of a calm email with a timestamp. And justice, when it finally came, taught me that relief doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it comes with a PDF. Every now and then, my mother sends me recipes. My father sends me garden photos. Roses, tomatoes, the fig tree he babied back from frost. I answer like the adult I am. I keep it kind. I keep it brief. I keep it written. We're a family that found a way to stop hurting each other by putting a professional in the middle. Some people will tell you that's sad. I think it's grown up. I kept one thing you might not expect, the envelope that started it all, the one that told me I'd been removed. It lives in the back of the binder now, a fossil from the era when my name was a suggestion. When I touch it, I don't feel small anymore. I feel the opposite. I feel the night I made a list instead of a scene, the morning I practiced my line, the moment the lawyer read a different page and the room went perfectly still. I feel my life standing up on its feet. So here's the moral nobody puts on tote bags. Boundaries don't fix people, they fix outcomes. You can't make anyone love you right. You can write down what happens if they don't. You can give yourself a future that doesn't depend on their mood. You can make fairness boring and permanent. You can make peace the default. And if someone tells you that's not family, remember that a fence keeps pets safe, gardens growing, and neighbors friendly. A good fence is love you can measure. If you're listening to this because your story rhymes with mine, here's what I learned when the room went quiet and the paper spoke. Start small. Write dates. Keep copies. Ask for names. Don't threaten, prepare. Don't escalate, document. Don't match cruelty, outlast it. Find one professional who gets paid to be boring and honest. Boring and honest will save your life. And when the moment comes, because it will, say your one sentence and let the silence do the rest. My last update is short because good endings are. The trust runs like a clock. The statements arrive. The family gatherings are shorter and kinder. Alex has learned how to sit in the same room as accountability. My mother sends fewer flowers and more photos of her garden. My father doesn't try to teach me lessons anymore. He asks about my week. The binder is heavy and stays under my bed, and I almost never open it now. I don't need to. Justice isn't a feeling you chase. It's a boundary you keep. I'm Emily, and this was never about money. It was about a page, a sentence, a line. And the day I said it, I finally got mine back.